thanks for coming down. I appreciate tonight is free, but you're paying with your time and your attention. I'm sure some of you have got exams and stuff on at the minute. So appreciate taking the time to come down tonight. So hopefully you'll get something from this. Just a little disclaimer before we begin on this. Although this is a talk on stress, and stress is very much linked to things like anxiety and depression, which I'll get into a little bit later. I suppose the purpose of this talk is to help deal with, I suppose, normal functioning levels of stress. So we're not here to deal with things like clinical levels of anxiety or depression, which can sometimes be caused by chronic stress. So if you think you might need some support around stuff like that, I've listed some really good professionals there. And also feel free to reach out and get in touch. I put my contact details there in the chat as well. And I can point you in the direction of someone that can help you with those kind of things. So I suppose I should introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I did do a talk here about a month ago, but the numbers seem a little bit bigger. So I might just say hello or explain who I am and what I do. So my name is Jason Moore, and I am a psychologist who specializes in the psychology of performance and development and well-being. So really what I'm all about is helping people move forward, and I tend to help them move forward by increasing their effectiveness. And to do this, I tend to look at three kind of main areas. So I tend to help people increase their happiness and well-being, because it turns out the happier we are and the higher our levels of well-being, then the more effective we can be. We tend to perform a lot better. So I might look at big kind of questions like who you are and where you're at. And I suppose it's very important to have a good understanding of who you are and where you're at and what makes you happy. So we might look at things like your personality. We might look at the balance between various aspects of your life or your career. We might look at your performance in various aspects of your career, or maybe within college, for example. A second area that I tend to help people in is to help them gain clarity about the future and get organized. So really what we're looking at there is your goals, So I suppose, are your goals structured in such a way that makes it more likely that you'll achieve them? Do you have a plan in place, Are you clear about what it is that you want? Is what you want in line with what's important to you? Is what you want, or are your goals in line with the person that you are as well? The third area that I tend to help people in is to help them to overcome barriers to their performance and their productivity. So those barriers can be both practical and psychological in nature. So practical barriers I help people with are things like behavior change, decision-making and problem solving. Have you got a really effective model to help you make the best decisions and to problem solve? We'll touch on some of the problem solving stuff later. More psychological barriers then are things like motivation, procrastination, confidence, and the topic of today, which is stress. So tonight we're going to look at what exactly stress is, and we're going to look at it from a couple of different angles, and then we're going to look at how we can go about dealing with it. So we're going to look at kind of various strategies we can use to deal with stress. So I suppose the overall purpose is to help us understand stress a little bit better, look at what works and why it works. And this is because different strategies will work for different people in different contexts, if you get me. Okay. So to begin, what I want you guys to do, so I'd ask you to grab a pen and a piece of paper. I'm sorry, and I know Finney had asked, so hopefully you have that. But what I'd like you to have a little think about for a minute is what is stressing you out, or maybe just to start to write down some of the topics or some of the things that are stressing you out at the minute. So I'm going to list some of the common ones in life and in university based on research, and just to give you some food for thought about the kind of things, maybe to help you put your finger on exactly what it is. So common stressors in life include our physical health. If that's not right, can lead to a lot of stress in other areas. Our finances, if we're struggling financially, and I suppose in college when you're not able to work full time because you're studying, there can be a lot of financial stress. Your home and your neighborhood. So if where you're living, if you're not comfortable where you're living, for example, or maybe you don't feel safe in the neighborhood that you're staying, that can lead to a lot of stress. Or relationships, so I suppose whether that's with our romantic other or whether that is with our family and friends, if your relationships aren't right in your life, that can lead to a lot of stress too. And similarly with your family, and I suppose for a lot of you guys, your family, you're not going to have kids per se, but I suppose if things aren't kind of going right in your familial situation, that can lead to a lot of stress as well. College-wise then, things like workload. So you probably got too much to do, or maybe some of your subjects you find difficult. I know myself when I was in college that the amount that they expected me to read and the amount that they expected me to do was absolutely crazy. Tiredness, which is a big one. So I suppose you need to have about 7 to 9 hours sleep consistently every night. Otherwise, you are probably going to be a bit tired. And tiredness is actually one of the leading causes of stress in modern life. Your relationships and your community within college. So I suppose if you don't feel connected in college, or if you don't have a good relationship with your classmates or with, I suppose, maybe the people that are teaching you, then that can lead to a lot of stress as well. This is very much linked to, I suppose, the current problem, which is isolation. And because of COVID and because of, I suppose, everyone having to attend classes, etc., from home, that there's not that sense of community and not that sense of connection that we would normally get. And finally, obviously enough, and we're, I suppose, right at the beginning of it, is exam season, and maybe that's something that's stressing you out. So if you jotted down a few of them, what I want you to do, for just to apply this to the rest of what we're going to talk about today, is I want you to pick one. I want you to pick maybe the thing that's bugging you the most, maybe the thing that's stressing you out the most. And what we're going to try and do is take that one stressor and we're going to apply it to some of the strategies and stuff I'm talking about today. And I suppose, especially with the kind of later sections of the talk, there'll be various questions and stuff you can ask yourself around that. So just pick one and we're going to apply it to this. Okay, so I suppose to begin, we better define what stress is. So if I could ask you guys, maybe just let me know in the chat box, how do you define stress? What do you think stress is? Just let me know in the chat box what your understanding of stress is. What do you think it is? Tension and worry. Yeah, I suppose what I would say about worry is almost the what goes on in your mind during stress. Yeah, very good. Pressure is something I hear very, very common, and it's almost like a physical thing, like a feeling. Yeah, completely. Something on your mind. Very good. Another one I often hear as well is that stress is an external event. It's like, oh, that's stress over there, or that's stressing me out. Or another common one is that it's an emotional response or a feeling. What I'm going to put to you today, I'm going to actually give you 3 different definitions of stress, or 3 different ways of looking at stress. And the reason that I'm looking at it from 3 different ways is that there's lots of different strategies, and these are kind of based on these 3 separate definitions. So the first definition is kind of physiological or biological in nature, and that's that stress is a biological response to a stressor. A second definition is that, and it's more psychological in nature, is that stress is when we perceive the demands of a situation to exceed our ability to cope. And a third definition I'm going to look at, and it's more problem focused, and that's that stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake. And again, the reason for this is that we're going to look at strategies in all these different areas that I suppose are dependent on these different definitions. Okay, so we're going to start off with the physiological. And I suppose thinking of stress as a physiological thing is important because this helps to explain a lot of its negative effects and why stress gets such bad press. And this is mainly due to a hormone called cortisol. So you want to have a think about what's called the basic stress response. It's this, is that we see something in the environment. Say we have an exam coming up and we get, our brain sees it as a threat, or it sees it as something to be stressed out about. And so our brain sends a message down to a gland that's just above our kidneys called the adrenal cortex. And the adrenal cortex releases hormones, and this leads to body-wide changes. And that's, I suppose, these body-wide changes are in order that you can kind of deal with your stressor or whatever's stressing you out. So you'll see in this diagram as well that there's an arrow going from the little body on the right, going back to the brain. And the reason that that's there is that a lot of how we kind of determine if we're stressed or we figure out, I suppose, if we're stressed or not, is that our brain or our mind in turn senses, I suppose, these body-wide changes, and that's how we decide that we're stressed. So for example, I don't know if you've ever noticed that if your heart is racing, or you might notice that you're breathing a little bit quicker when you're nervous about something, or maybe you're sweating or something. And that's important later for how we deal with the physiological aspects of stress. We go into a little bit more detail. There's actually 2 kind of stress responses. So the first is what's called the acute response, and this is very, very quick. And the second is called the chronic response, which is slower and more prolonged and over time. So the acute response is also known as the fight or flight response. What happens is this is we send something in the environment that stresses her out. Our brain sends a message down to our adrenal glands, and our adrenal glands release a hormone called adrenaline. And adrenaline leads to a series of changes around the body. So for example, our liver produces glucose and puts it into our bloodstream. Our heart rate increases and flow increases. And so what's happening here is our liver is creating glucose to give us energy to deal with or to fight or flight, whatever the threat is. So we either get aggressive or we run away. And our heart rate and flow increases in order to move that fuel around the body to where it's needed so that we can fight or flight. Similarly, our lungs open up, and that's to get more oxygen in, which is to add more kind of fuel to the fire. And also some non-essential systems close down. So for example, our digestion stops. And so this explains why we get things like nauseous or butterflies in our stomach when we're in like a stressful situation. The second type of stress response, this is the one we're more concerned with, and this is called the chronic stress response. So this is more slow and prolonged. So if we're consistently getting stressed, or if we're stressed over a long period of time, this is what happens. And same thing happens, our brain sends a message down to our adrenal cortex, but a very different hormone is released at this point, and this is called cortisol. And cortisol, it's got similar but different effects to adrenaline, so it's much more long lasting. So one of the things it does is that it maintains this glucose level in our blood, so we kind of always have that energy in our system in order to deal with whatever threats. Our blood pressure kind of stays consistently high, for example, and again, that's to kind of move that fuel around your body. And it also has got anti-inflammatory properties. So that's if you get injured, that you don't swell up and you're not able to use a limb. Again, your body also shuts down these non-essential systems that we don't need to kind of deal with the immediate threat. So for example, your immune system is shut down. So if you want to think of the acute stress response as putting your foot on the gas, and that's getting, I suppose, fuel into the machine in order to deal with whatever's stressing you out. The chronic stress response is like if you're constantly putting your foot in the gas. And I don't know if any of you drive, so maybe it's not the best analogy, but if you're constantly putting your foot on the gas in a car, eventually what you're going to do is you're going to burn out the engine. Okay. So why all the stress about stress? Well, it turns out that this hormone cortisol has got some pretty negative effects on our health in the medium to long term. So as I said earlier, cortisol increases our blood pressure. It also increases our blood sugar. It puts glucose into the system. And it also suppresses our immune system. And as a result, this leads to a lot of chronic diseases. So it's chronic stress and cortisol have been linked to things like arteriosclerosis and chronic heart disease. So arteriosclerosis is when the arteries in your heart thicken. And that's due to that increased blood pressure. And so in order to deal with the extra pressure, your arteries actually get thicker over time in order to deal with that. And that eventually can lead to blockages and heart attacks in older age. It's also very much linked to autoimmune diseases. So by your immune system constantly being turned on and off when you're chronically stressed, it kind of upsets the delicate balance. And similarly with your digestion. So things like stomach ulcers and other digestion issues are very much associated with stress. And again, this is because they're kind of shutting off these non-essential systems. Stress has also been linked to negative health behaviors, which can also have some really negative effects on your physical health. So we tend to drink more, we tend to smoke more, for example, when we're stressed. Stress is also very much linked to lots of negative effects on our mental health. It's got a very, very strong link with things like anxiety and depression, and also with being unsocial, which in turn are very much linked to anxiety and depression. The reason that this happens, so what you've got in the normal stress response, or when we're not chronically stressed, when we're going through, I suppose, a manageable amount of stress, what happens is this hormone cortisol is released into our system. After a bit of time, this response ends, and there's enzymes in your blood that break down the cortisol and absorb it back into it. So it turns out cortisol is actually damaging to neurons in your brain. And so too much of it can lead to damage in this area. So when we're chronically stressed, what happens is this cortisol is continuously released into our bloodstream. There's too much of it, and eventually these enzymes are overwhelmed. The enzymes can't break it all down, so the cortisol starts to build up. And as it builds up, one of the first things that happens is that it starts to damage the regions in your brain that measure and regulate cortisol. And what this in turn leads to is a positive feedback loop. So these regions that damaging or that measure and control the amount of cortisol in your system, when these get damaged, then more cortisol builds up. And eventually this cortisol starts to damage regions in your brain that are linked to things like anxiety and depression. So I suppose that just explains why it's so bad for your mental health and what the link is there. So it turns out it's high levels of cortisol and high levels of stress are also very bad for your performance. So a little bit of stress can be very good for your performance. And I suppose you guys probably experienced this, especially those of you who play rugby quite a bit. A little bit of tension before the game is good. But once it gets too much, it does things like impairs your ability to problem solve, impairs your cognition, affects your memory and concentration. You can suffer from burnout, which is like a lack of motivation and also feeling overwhelmed. And this is very much linked to some of the symptoms of stress, which I'm going to run through now. So what I want you to do, so if you've kind of identified that one thing that maybe is, I suppose, the most important to your stressor right now, the next thing I want you to know or to do is I want you to have a little think about how do you know when you're stressed? What are your symptoms? Just to try and create a little bit of awareness around that. Okay. So maybe just take a minute about this. Stick these into the chat box if anything sticks into mind. But it turns out our symptoms, there tends to be 4 different types. So I want you to try to put your finger on the things that happen to you when you're stressed. And this is just about increasing awareness around it because it's not always obvious, you know. So the first set of symptoms are physical. So we tend to suffer from muscle tension and headaches when we're stressed. And this is because of a fight or flight response where we're getting ready to kind of go and move the whole time. So we're kind of tense, our muscles tense up. And over time, that can lead to quite bad muscle tension. Headaches come from, it's actually the muscles in the back of your neck when they get particularly tense. That in turn leads to headaches. Another common physical symptom of chronic stress is we can have sexual problems. And this is because the hormones that I suppose lead to, I suppose when your body's overproducing cortisol, what happens is there's not enough resources there to produce the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. And so this can lead to kind of hormonal imbalances. Other kind of common stress physical symptoms are things like stomach problems or dry mouth or bowel or bladder issues. And this is because our digestive system is being shut down when we're stressed. And maybe the most common physical symptom of stress is sweating. You'll see this a lot when people are speaking in public, for example. More psychological stress symptoms are things like your thoughts racing. So you're going over and over things in your head or you're constantly worrying. And this has got to do with really what's happening here is because we're trying to solve the stressor, we're trying to deal with the stressor in our head. And if the stressor isn't going away, then we kind of get stuck in a loop around this. And so I've got a strategy for this a little later. Another thing we can do is catastrophize. This is where we blow things out of proportion. And this kind of happens because, you know, if we're constantly stuck in a loop and we're constantly trying to solve the problem in our head, eventually we can blow it out of proportion a little bit. Other psychological symptoms are we can be very forgetful and we can also have difficulty concentrating. And this is, I suppose, again, if we're focused on the stressor is kind of taking over our thoughts or even on our subconscious kind of level, it can be very difficult to focus on whatever you're doing now. Very much linked to this then are some of the emotional symptoms of stress. So we can be more irritable, we can be more anxious, our self-esteem can be lower and our mood can be lower. And these are very much linked to the changes in your brain caused by cortisol. These in turn can lead to you feeling quite unsociable. So if you're feeling irritable or anxious or your self-esteem is a bit low, I suppose you don't really want to have to be dealing with other people as well, you know. The more behavioral symptoms of stress are things like our temper tends to be shorter. We can tend to be a bit more unreasonable. And again, these are linked to the changes in your brain due to cortisol. But also those behavioral habits are things like, you know, we tend to drink more, smoke more. If you use illicit drugs, then you would tend to use illicit drugs more. And this is almost, I suppose, these are avoidance behaviors. So we're trying to avoid feeling stressed by using these negative coping strategies. Another common behavioral stress symptom is people tend to talk faster and they talk more. So it's almost like we're trying to solve the problem verbally, you know, but by talking our way out of it. And this can be a good one. I'm just thinking, I suppose, of in terms of how you might apply this in a rugby situation. But I suppose if you see the opposition and they're constantly nattering away at you, sometimes that might be a sign that they're actually a bit worried or a bit stressed. Finally, we can be quite clumsy when we're stressed. And this is very much linked to this difficulty in concentrating when we're stressed, because again, we're not focused on what we're doing, we're focused, or like part of our, I suppose, focus is on what's stressing us out. Okay, so you can see how these symptoms can lead to negative performance, whether it's on the rugby pitch or whether it's in college. So what I'd like you to do today is to maybe, I suppose, try and apply what I'm about to kind of go through next And I'm going to put forward like lots of different strategies. And the reason I'm putting forward so many different strategies and trying to give you a taste of so many things is that different strategies are going to work for different people in different contexts. So a lot of the reason of that is that when you're dealing with stress, a lot of time what you're doing is you're treating symptoms. And so it's to have a look at these different symptoms. It can give you a good starting point on how best to deal with your stress. So what I suggest you do is to define your symptoms. So if your symptoms are more physiological in nature, so if you're feeling muscle tension and stuff, then maybe some of the physiological strategies might be best. If your symptoms are more psychological in nature, so for example, if your mind is racing over and over, then maybe some of the psychological strategies might be best. So what I advise people to do usually is to define your symptoms, have a look at what's figuring or what's stressing you out, and then based on that, choose kind of a most appropriate strategy and try it out. And try different things because again, different things work for different people in different contexts at different times, you know. So I'm going to run through three types of strategies. The first are physiological, the second are psychological, and the third are more problem solving strategies. Okay. So physiological strategies. First one I want to, so there's a couple of books on this. If you want to go a little bit deeper, these are really good books because they're very practical kind of workbooks. So they're written in such a way that, you know, you can kind of flick through them and kind of pick out what exercises might work best for you. They're both excellent. So it's the relaxation and stress reduction workbook and the anxiety and phobia workbook. I'm going to share some resources and I'll share the slides with you guys as well. So don't worry too much about writing down authors and stuff. It'll all be on the slides. So the first physiological strategy I want to talk about, I'm sure most of you will be very familiar with this, is exercise. So exercise actually works by releasing feel-good endorphins into your system, which kind of counteract the negative effects of cortisol. And it also really helps with treating with that symptom of muscle tension. So it turns out the more you use your muscles, actually, the less tense they kind of can get to be. So, I mean, I think this is important, especially when you're doing in exam season or whatever. You can get very stuck in, I suppose, stuck at your desk, and for obvious reasons. So it's very important to kind of keep exercising regularly in order to kind of keep your stress low. To get a bit more specific in terms of exercise and to get the benefits of exercise, what you really need to be doing is you need to be hitting your target heart rate for about 20 minutes. You need to be doing that 3 or 4 times a week. But if you find yourself, I suppose, stuck in a long study session, etc., getting out for 20 minutes and going for a brisk run can do wonders. What you really want to be hitting here is you want to be hitting your target heart rate for 20 minutes, whatever exercise you're doing. So you can calculate your target heart rate, and that is 60 to 80% of your maximum heart rate. And you can calculate your maximum heart rate by taking your age away from the number 220. So in my instance, my maximum heart rate is 181 beats per minute. So that's the number 220 minus my age, which is 39. And so then to get 60 to 80% of that, so 60% of 181 beats per minute is 109. 80% of 181 beats per minute is 145. So in order for me to get the benefits of exercise to deal with my stress, I need to be exercising for about 20 to 30 minutes where my heart rate's between 109 and 145 BPM. Again, a lot of you guys are athletes and stuff, so I'm sure you're probably familiar with beats per minute in terms of getting that up there. But you can get very cheap heart rate monitors and stuff, you know, on Amazon for about 20 bucks, just little wrist ones. The next strategy, the next physiological strategy I want to talk a little bit about is relaxation. What we're after here is what's called the relaxation response. So the relaxation response is like the stress response's good twin, if you get me. So it's all, so I suppose when you're in this, I suppose when you're feeling very relaxed is another way to think about it. Your heart rate tends to lower, your breathing tends to go very slow and deep. Your blood pressure as a result tends to drop. You tend to think less analytically. We tend to be much more in the present moment. And so what this causes then is kind of a reversal of the negative effects of stress. So very, very important. And so a very, very important idea around this is the idea of downtime. And we're all very, very busy at the minute, but in terms of downtime, you need to be doing kind of 3 particular behaviors. You need to be resting. You need to be doing stuff that's recreational. So stuff that you enjoy and that kind of recreate your energy, let's say your hobbies. And you also need to be spending time in your relationships. So in terms of the minimum you need to be kind of doing, or this is the minimum recommendation in terms of downtime, you need to be spending 1 out of every 24 hours, 1 day out of every week, and 1 week out of every 12 weeks in spending your downtime in order to kind of keep your stress at minimal levels. And downtime, just to make a point, it's not sleep. It's a completely different thing. So it's like resting, like chilling out, spending time on your hobbies, or spending time in your relationships, maybe with the people you love or your family and friends. You know, if you are feeling some of the physiological symptoms of stress, then what you probably really need to be doing is about 20 to 30 minutes daily of a deep relaxation technique. So here's some of the common ones. So abdominal breathing, and that's a breathing technique where you breathe right into your abdomen. And I'm going to run you through one of these a little bit later. So it might be better if I show you rather than talk too much about it. But what this does is it calms down your whole body. And by slowing down your breathing, you're slowing down your heart rate. And what that starts to do is starts to send a message to your brain almost subconsciously that you're relaxed. And so you're kind of hitting that feedback loop, and your brain starts to think or be tricked into thinking that you're not so much stressed anymore. And that's the kind of case with all these relaxation techniques. It's actually that relaxation response, and I suppose your mind starting to feel relaxed when your body feels relaxed. That's actually the basis of how drugs like Valium work. So Valium was originally developed as a muscle relaxant, and when they had it in the clinical trials in order to help treat people with muscle spasms from having sore backs. And people came back and they went, "Oh, my back is totally relaxed, but I feel great. I feel really relaxed." And what was actually happening there is the Valium was relaxing all the muscles in the people's body, and that was kind of sending a message to their brain that everything was okay. And so it really helped reduce anxiety. The second relaxation technique I want to talk a little bit about is yoga. So yoga works by, again, you're controlling your breathing, but you're also consciously relaxing your muscles. So again, works on that same kind of method. There is lots of free yoga online. There's some amazing stuff. Yoga with Adrian is particularly good. And I'm going to share a resource in a minute that's got some really good yoga classes on it as well. Another really good physiological relaxation technique to try is a thing called progressive muscle relaxation. Give this a Google. Pat DeVilly, he's like a motivational speaker. He does a particularly good one. But progressive muscle relaxation is all about tensing the muscles in your body in sequence, really like intensely for about 10 seconds. And then after that, consciously relaxing them. And there's something in consciously tensing a muscle group in your body and then consciously relaxing that gives it a very deep relaxation. This is amazing. The first time I done this, it was like life-changing how relaxing it was. The final meditation technique I want to talk a little bit about is, or the final relaxation technique I want to talk a bit about is meditation. So I won't go into the depths of how meditation works really, but it's all about, I suppose, concentrating on the present moment. And so a lot of stress that we have is from worrying about the future or worrying about things that happened in the past. And meditation really helps you focus on the present moment. The reason I mention that is there is a couple of pretty amazing free courses out there at the minute. So if you do want to give meditation a try, and more specifically mindfulness-based stress reduction meditation, there's some really good courses free online. So the first is Palouse Mindfulness. This is like an 8-week very high intensity mindfulness meditation course. It's run by a guy called Dave Potter from the States, and he is a retired clinical psychologist. So this mindfulness course is based on the course in California that was kind of the basis of, I mean, maybe why mindfulness meditation has become worldwide famous. So this is a very deep 8-week course. We do 40 minutes a day for 8 weeks. But if you were to do this course in person in Dublin, it would cost you about 500 quid. So if you want to really give meditation a go, check that out. Again, I'll send on the slides with all the links. The second one I want to mention, it's a bit more of a gentle introduction if you've never done any meditation before, and that's about the Waking Up app by Sam Harris. So there's a paid version of this, but if you go onto the app, there is a version that you can get for free, but you just have to email them and explain you're a student or whatever, and they'll send you a free sign-up code. But this is like lots of kind of shorter 10, 15-minute meditations, which is a very good introduction to it. So the other relaxation technique I had mentioned a little earlier was abdominal breathing. So what I'm going to do with you guys now, I'm going to do a demonstration, and I'm going to get you guys to try this particular breathing technique. So this is called 4-7-8 breathing. And I learned this from a guy called Andrew Wheel online. And so I suppose what I'd like you to do with this, with your pen and piece of paper, if that's okay, is I want you to rate your stress. More specifically, I want you to rate how tense you are on a scale of 1 to 10 before we do this. So just write a number between 1 to 10. So 1 being you're completely and utterly relaxed, and 10 being you're very stressed out, and just see how you feel after this, just to give you an idea. So what 4-7-8 breathing involves, it involves breathing in kind of deeply for 4 breaths, you hold it for 7, and then you breathe out for 8. So to start off, what you do is you put your tongue on the roof of your mouth, and you breathe in through your nose for 4. You just hold that breath for 7, and then you breathe out slowly for a count of 8. And while you're breathing out, you want to consciously relax. So I'm going to demonstrate it and show you what it looks like. And then I'm going to run you guys through 4 cycles of it. Okay. And then we'll just see how you feel afterwards. Okay. So it just looks a little something like this. So I breathe in for 4, hold it for 7, and then out for 8. And the whole time you've got your tongue on the roof of your mouth. Okay, so we're just going to do 4 cycles of that. If you want, feel free to turn off your camera if you're a bit conscious about how you're going to look doing this. And I'll have a little bit of a chat about it afterwards as well, and tell you when it's good to use this. Okay, so what I want you to do, I want you to put your 2 feet on the ground. I want you to put your hands on your lap, so that they're not touching, that you're just sitting on either leg. And then I want you to put your tongue on the roof of your mouth, just like that. It just kind of helps with your breathing. And then what we're going to do, we're going to breathe in through your nose for 4, hold it for 7, and breathe out through your mouth for 8 while you consciously relax. Okay. So breathe in for 4, 2, 3, 4, and hold it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out slowly for 8. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And in for 4, 2, 3, 4. Hold it for 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out slowly for 8. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And in for 4, 2, 3, 4, and hold for 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out for 8. 2, 3, and relax. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Once more. In for 4, 2, 3, 4, and hold it for 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out for 8. 2, 3, 4, and relax. 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so rate your stress from 1 to 10 afterwards. Be curious, maybe let me know in the chat box how you found that. Did I just sound like a crazy man talking into the internet? So I like to use that in a couple of different instances. I would have used it just before I came online today. It's very useful just before a situation where you're going to put yourself in a bit of stress, and it just brings down your physiology. It's very useful if you wake up in the middle of the night and maybe your mind is racing and you can't get back to sleep. It's very useful just in little moments where you're feeling a little bit of pressure, a little bit of tension, a little bit of stress. And I like it for a couple of reasons. It's quick, it's free, you can use it in a moment. I just did 4 cycles there. You probably 8 cycles can be quite good. They recommend maybe not going over 8. I'm not sure why. And it's just it's free, quick, easy to do.
Jason.
Yes.
Just on that, Like, is it normal to get a little lightheaded? Like, I was feeling lightheaded there. Like, I could feel the body getting looser, but I could feel
Yeah,
myself getting a little bit lighter. Is
yeah.
that normal? Or
It's no, sorry, Vinny, you're doomed. No, it's completely normal. It's what's happening there is you're just getting particularly relaxed. I mean, I wouldn't kind of, don't do it in a swimming pool kind of thing, but like that's why you kind of keep it to just 8 cycles.
no, it felt great though. It felt
Yeah,
great. It
yeah,
felt like real buzzy, nearly.
yeah, yeah, completely.
No, he's kicking
You
in.
get a bit
The
addicted
teeth
to
are
it.
kicking in.
Yeah. Okay, so guys, going to take a 5 minute break. I hope you found that useful. Does anyone have any questions before we take a break? Feel free to unmute yourself or stick it into the chat. Or if you think of any questions while you're on the break, I can answer them when you get back.
Or any questions for me as well?
Cool.
Feel free.
Okay, cool. I'll see you guys in 5.
See you in 5.
Nice.
Guys.
I'll stick a timer up on the screen. Okay, so the next type of strategy type of strategies I'm going to have a look at are more psychological in nature. Okay, so psychological strategies, they're based on a slightly different definition of stress, and that stress is when the demands of a situation exceed our ability to cope. So this is very much perceptual, I suppose, to an extent. So it's when we perceive that maybe we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, or maybe we don't have enough social support, or we don't have enough energy, or maybe we don't have enough clarity about what it is that we need to do, or we don't have enough motivation, things like that. So 2 strategies I'm going to have a look at are what are called cognitive reframing, and I'm also going to have a look at what are called coping strategies. Okay, so before we get into that, before I get into the psychological strategies, I want to have a look at what's called the psychological stress response. So we just looked at the physiological or the biological stress response, and this is the psychological one is more what's going on in your mind. Yeah. So it's simple in one way. So imagine you've got a stressor in the environment. So you guys are an exam system. So you've got an upcoming exam. Yeah. And so what do you do in your mind when you come across a stressor like that? Well, it turns out you ask yourself 2 questions. Simply enough, the first question you ask yourself, is it stressful? Is this something I need to worry about? And the second question is, can I cope? Now, for the first question, is it stressful? Maybe you don't. So for if you want to think of the exam example, like imagine you don't know what's coming up in the exam. So you don't know if it's stressful or not. So what you do in that instance is you just go and you gather more info. So maybe you talk to your mates or you talk to the professor. However, oh, sorry. So, sorry, you ask yourself these 2 questions and then that leads to your behavior. So you respond based on these 2 questions. So you might decide that it isn't stressful. So imagine this exam is coming up, maybe you know all the material, or maybe it's not going to affect your final grade for the module or affect your final grade for the year. So you don't really care. So it's irrelevant or it's positive, it's a good thing. So you don't have to do anything. However, if your answer to the question, is it stressful, is yes, then you ask yourself the second question, can I cope with it? Yeah. We have 2 possible responses to the question, can I cope? First off, we can think, yes, I can cope. And this is when we see things as a challenge. And so we experience stressors or stressful things as a challenge, as a good thing, when there's an opportunity that we can gain from it, or there's an opportunity that for self-growth, and we've got available strategies to cope. And so all we do in that instance then is we take direct action. We act on the challenge, or we act on the stress, or we do something about it. So for example, with that upcoming exam, perhaps we know the exam is stressful, it's important, but we have time, we believe in our ability to study hard, maybe we've done well in the subject before. And so we draw up a plan of attack, we maybe put up a study plan and we get to work. So the second response to the question is, can I cope, can be no. And that's when we start to see things as a threat. And so we experience stressors or stress as a threat when I suppose the situation looks like it's going to lead to failure, there's nothing, and we can't cope with it. There's nothing we can do. So what we do in that instance then is we start to develop coping mechanisms. So these are just ways of dealing with the stress. And these mechanisms can be both positive and negative. So positive coping mechanisms might be maybe some of those physiological strategies I was talking about earlier, exercise or relaxation or something to kind of help deal with the stress. More negative coping strategies then can be things like drinking more, smoking more. Maybe the most common negative coping strategy is avoidance. We tend to avoid it. So, I suppose imagine that exam is coming up and we don't have enough time. Maybe we find the subject difficult. And so what we do is we stick our head in the sand and we just ignore the problem completely. So we can kind of forget about the top right-hand corner there. We're just going to have a look first at these two questions, whether we're deciding something is stressful and if we can cope with it or not. So is it stressful? What I'm going to talk a little bit about here is reframing. And reframing is important in that when we look at situations, sometimes our thinking isn't the most helpful or isn't the most realistic. And these are called unhelpful or unrealistic thinking patterns. Yeah? So for example, we might think in black and white, or what's known as all or nothing thinking. So, for example, with that upcoming exam, we think, well, look, if I don't get a first or if it's not perfect, well, then I might as well have failed. Another thing we tend to do, especially when we're feeling stressed or that leads to a lot of stress, is we tend to use what's called a mental filter, or we disqualify the positive. So this is where we ignore certain types of information or we only focus on the negative. So this might be someone who got 90% on that exam, but they go around saying, well, I got 10% wrong. So this is where they're focusing on the little bits that have gone wrong rather than everything that's gone right. Again, can lead to a lot of stress. Another common unhelpful thinking style that we often have, and we all do these all the time, by the way, it's just when it leads to kind of chronic stress is when you need to have a look at them, is what's called emotional reasoning. And so emotional reasoning is when we assume that because we feel in a certain way, then what we're thinking must be true. So a very common one is, I'm embarrassed, so I must be an idiot. Or maybe if we think of our exam example, it might be something like, I'm anxious, so I'm right in thinking I won't be able to cope with the pressure of this, so I'm going to fail, So it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to an extent. Another common unhelpful or unrealistic thinking style we often use is the overuse of should or must. And the issue with this is overusing should or must can often lead to guilt and shame. So for example, in this exam example, you might be saying, I should have studied more, or I must work harder, or I have to get an A+. And this puts an awful lot of pressure on us, one, and two, again, leads to guilt and shame. Another thing we often do is jump to conclusions. So for example, we tend to try, or we think we can predict the future. We assume that we know what the outcome is, when often it's not necessarily all that certain. Or another common version of this is we think we can read other people's minds. So for example, you might be thinking in your exam example, I'm going to fail. And as a result of thinking that you're going to fail, the people are going to think I'm an idiot or whatever, or people are going to think I'm a failure. Very much related to this is the idea of magnification, also known as catastrophization. This is where we blow things out of proportion. So not only do we think we're going to fail, it's going to be a disaster, and my life is going to be ruined, all based on the exam. And the thing with all of these, again, they're very common. We all do them all the time, but they can lead to a lot of stress. So what do you do about it? Well, often what I'll do with clients a lot of time is I'll ask very specific questions when they come to me and they're stressed. So maybe you might ask yourself something like, actually in this instance, what's the worst that could happen? Yeah. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to think whatever that stressor or that thing that's stressing you out. And I want you to just have a think about these questions, maybe write down some rough answers while I'm going through them. But just ask yourself these questions in relation to that one thing that was kind of stressing you out. So I'm going to use the example of the exam while I talk through it, but take your time on these for a minute. So in our exam example, if you asked maybe what's the worst that could happen? Well, maybe the worst thing that could happen in an exam situation is that you fail. And the next question I want you to consider is, if that happened, how could I cope? Well, maybe in an exam situation, you probably have a chance to repeat the exam, and again, worst case scenario, all that can happen is you can fail it. And there probably is another way to kind of get through your course or your year anyway. The reason that's one of the first questions I ask is that often in situations the worst case scenario is so scary to us that we don't actually make it concrete. We don't actually, and I suppose thinking about what it is and writing it down and putting it down on paper can take away a certain amount of its power, because the worst that can happen is usually something that you can cope with anyway. The next question I want you to consider, and the next question that I often ask people is, well, what actually, if we're allowed to consider a worst, what's the best that could happen in a situation? Because often we tend to focus on the negative, and this can lead to a lot of stress. So we should be allowed to kind of focus on the positive as well. So have a think about it in the situation. What's the best that could happen in the situation? And maybe if you think about that upcoming exam, maybe you get lucky in the questions or the material that you know comes up. And so it's fine. You know? Another question I think is very important to consider then in relation to this is, what's the most realistic outcome? So often I find the most realistic outcome is somewhere between the worst and the best. And so in our exam example, maybe it's, you know, I work hard and I managed to pull it off. So it's not the worst that could happen, but it wasn't easy. You know? So have a think about that and see if you can apply it. Another question we can ask, especially when we're doing things like, I suppose, assuming we know what's going to happen, or that the worst is going to happen, you can ask yourself, am I jumping to conclusions here? You know, what's the evidence that this is actually going to be as bad as I think it's going to be? And similarly, you know, am I blowing this out of proportion? Am I catastrophizing this? And a final question I really like to ask and apply to stressful situations is, will it matter in 10, 10, 10, 10? What 10, 10, 10 stands for is, will it matter in 10 weeks? Will it matter in 10 months? Or will it matter in 10 years? And what I suppose what we're trying to do with these series of questions really is to try and get some perspective on the whole problem. Because I know the things that I thought were very important and that I used to worry about massively 10 years ago or even 10 months ago, maybe don't really apply as much now. And again, different questions will work in different situations, but have a think through those and see, do any of them help? Okay. So one particular thinking style I want to have a little talk about is perfectionism. And you'll see this quote, I suppose, a lot in the corporate world, a lot is that perfect is the enemy of good. So perfectionism is the drive to have everything absolutely perfect. And the issue with this is that we spend too much time trying to perfect, or spend too much time on some tasks, this can lead to a lack of time or lack of energy to kind of work on others or the whole. So overall, it can be very negative for your performance. I think this stems from school, where, you know, we are rewarded for fully completing tasks or getting everything 100%. When I suppose the reality of life is that it's impossible to be perfect in everything, you know. So a common kind of belief around perfectionism is, if it's not perfect, then I'm a failure, you know, where we tend to label ourselves as a failure if everything we do isn't perfect. It's very much linked to unrealistic or high expectations. You'll find perfectionists expect to be getting 100% in exams, etc., etc. And whereas exams aren't, I suppose, designed for people to be getting 100%. It's also very much linked to ignoring what's right and focusing on what's wrong. So this is someone who gets 90% in an exam and then stresses out and focuses on that 10% that they got wrong. So what I'd ask you to do in this instance, you know, if perfectionism is maybe underlying some of your stresses, can be a very good question to ask yourself, give yourself a bit of distance, is, what would you say to a close friend if he or she were in the same position? What advice would you give them if they're worried about something not being perfect? I suppose the reason for this is that, you know, when we think about this and we give ourselves a little bit of different distance, it allows us to see that our self-worth is not equal to our achievements in life. And I mean, a good way of thinking about that is, you know, I'm sure there's people you love and value in your life massively that maybe, you know, aren't world beaters or haven't achieved absolutely everything. That our self-worth is not just based on our success. Another kind of question to think about when you're thinking around perfectionism is it helpful, you know? So is it helping your performance overall? So how is it making you feel? Is it helping you move towards your overall goals? You know, being perfectionist on one particular area or in all areas, you know, is it actually helping your performance? And I think a very kind of helpful mantra to say, like, if you happen to be a bit of a perfectionist, is to learn how to say when it's good enough. You know, when we got 80%, is that fine? Can we move on? You know? Okay. The next question to deal with in that whole psychological stress response. So once we've decided whether it's stressful or not, well, if we've decided it's stressful, the next question is, well, can I cope with that stress? So that question, can I cope, I think breaks down into two areas. The first is self-belief, and the second is, you know, what strategies can we use to cope? So in terms of self-belief, I think a very good question. And again, I want you to apply this to the stressor, or the thing that you had said you were, the one stressor that you picked. I want you to ask yourself the question, have you dealt with similar challenges in the past? You know, have you managed to cope with something similarly in the past? And the reason I ask that is, well, two reasons. One is, if you did deal with it in the past, what strategies did you use, and can you use them again? So it's very problem focused. And the second is that, well, even if you had the stressor in the past and you didn't deal with it very, very well, what can you learn from having dealt with it in the past? What can you do differently? You know? Another thing that can really help with our self-belief is if we break it down. So a lot of stressors can seem like big, scary, difficult to deal with problems. So, I mean, if you go back to our exam examples, some exams can seem so big and huge, but, you know, what can help kind of in terms of, I suppose, helping with procrastination and helping us get moving on it is if we take that big problem, we break it down into manageable chunks. Yeah. When you break it down into manageable chunks, then it doesn't seem so big and vague, and you can kind of make specific actions and start to work on it. The second element I want to talk about in terms of this question, can I cope with coping strategies? So there's kind of three main types. The first are those physiological coping strategies. So that's relaxation and exercise to deal with the physiological effects. And these are important, especially if you're dealing with, especially as an initial kind of way of dealing with stress, because this allows you to relax enough that you can kind of use some of these more psychological strategies or problem solving strategies. The second kind of coping strategy that's very important is maybe getting some social support. So, you know, talk to your friends, talk to your teammates, talk to your college mates. And I know at the minute that that's obviously much more difficult because of COVID. But if you are having trouble, you know, if you don't have people to talk to about what's stressing you out, then it can be useful to get some professional support, you know. So hopefully in TUD, I imagine they've got some free counselling services. But, you know, there's lots and lots of professionals out there that can kind of provide that support for you as well. The third type of coping strategy you can use then are what are called emotional coping strategies. And emotional coping strategies are strategies that we use in order to deal with the negative emotions around stress. So I'm going to bring you through one of those now. This is called expressive writing. So expressive writing was developed by a guy called James Pennebaker in the late 70s and early 80s. And I like this for three reasons. It's quick to do, it's free, and it's very, very, very effective. There's a lot of huge scientific studies behind this to show that it works. So all you do so the original studies were based on this, that you write about a stressful event or a traumatic event or whatever's stressing you out for 15 to 20 minutes over 4 consecutive days. So what you want to do is you want to write continuously. Don't worry about punctuation or spelling and grammar. You literally just want to express yourself about whatever's stressing you out. Just keep writing, if you get me. So you want to write in the first person. So you're saying things like, I am, I feel. And this isn't something you're ever going to show anybody. In fact, you can probably throw it away afterwards if you want. But the idea with not showing anyone is you want to write completely honestly about it. And this helps you express it. So this kind of works in two ways. One, you're kind of processing whatever's stressing you out by expressing it and writing it down. And two, by writing it down, you're making it much more concrete. When you make it concrete, then you can start to, I suppose, problem solve and deal with it. I'm kind of going to go into some more problem solving strategies later, but it's going to be a very good starting point. So a couple of points about this is, one is we have what's called the flip out rule. So if you get into writing about this and you find that maybe you're finding it very, very stressful, or that you think it might push you over the edge, kind of like, just stop writing. It's completely fine to do it and then come back to it at another time. Sometimes people feel a little bit saddened or down after doing this expressive writing. similarly to if you've watched a sad movie, whatever, but this usually goes away after an hour or two. So it's completely normal if you try this and you do feel a bit sad afterwards. But a lot of scientific studies to show in the medium to long term that this is pretty massive effects on stress. So we're going to do this, and I'm going to get you guys to do this for a couple of minutes. So what I want you to do, I want you to take your pen and a piece of paper, and I want you to write about your stressor in stream of consciousness, like just what's going through your mind for 10 minutes. So if you can't think of what, if you're writing and you finish, just go back and start writing again. So just pick that one thing that's stressing you out. And I want you to write in the first person. So I want you to say things, like I want, I feel, I think. And if you need maybe some prompts in order to think about what you might write about, maybe look at this. I want you to write about how do I feel? What's causing me to feel that way? And what thoughts am I having about the event or the stressor or the challenge or whatever way you want to frame it? And so bear in mind, sometimes people do get a little bit sad or depressed after this, but it does go away. And if it gets a little bit too much, then feel free to stop writing or write about something else. Okay. Is that okay? So you guys good to try this for a couple of minutes? I'm going to set a timer. I'll put on a little bit of background music. So if you're listening to this recording at home, what I'd like you to do now is pause the video for 10 minutes and give the exercise a try. So give it a go. The reason that I get people to do this during a talk that I'm doing is that it's difficult to, I suppose, think that this is going to kind of work until you actually try it. I find this very, very useful if my mind is racing or if things are going over and over and over in my head. And how it seems to work is because you're putting it down in paper. It's like you're getting it out of your head and you're getting it out in front of you. And again, that just makes it much, much easier in time to problem solve. Okay, so I'm going to run into the last. So I hope you found that useful. Maybe just let me know in the chat box how you find that. I'd be curious when you have a second, please. Okay, so the last group of strategies I'm going to talk about are more problem-focused in nature. And these are based on the definition of stress, that stress is something that arises from something you care about is at stake. So I'm going to look at this idea of a stress mindset. I'm also going to have a look at a problem-solving model in terms of individual problems, and then maybe what you can do in terms of if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed in your day-to-day. Okay, so maybe just have a little think about this. What is the effect of seeing your stress as a bad thing? So I suppose at the beginning of the talk, I talked about how negative stress is and how it's a bad thing. But how do you think, I suppose, when you are stressed, if you also feel or know that stress is so bad for you, how does that make you feel and how does that make you act? So maybe just have a little think about that when I'm talking about this. So the first strategy I want to talk about is talking about changing your stress mindset. This is maybe about looking at stress a little bit as your friend. This is the basis of a book by Kelly McGonigal. So I sent you around, or I asked Vinny to send around a TED talk beforehand by this lady, Kelly McGonigal. And it's based on her book, The Upside of Stress. And that's where I got this definition of stress from her, that stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake. Maybe what you'll notice about that is that the definition isn't necessarily very negative. So the book is about this idea of your stress mindset. So there's two types of stress mindset. One is that stress is harmful, stress is a bad thing. And I suppose that's based on a lot of the, press around cortisol and all those things. The second stress mindset we can have is that stress is actually enhancing, and that stress is not necessarily a bad thing, that it can maybe help us perform and give us the motivation and energy and concentration that we need in order to deal with our stressors. What's very interesting about this is it turns out a lot of the negative outcomes of stress, so the negative physical outcomes, the negative mental outcomes, tend to happen when we have this stress is harmful mindset. So what's going on here? How come just by thinking stress is a bad thing, how can it have worse effects? So what seems to be happening is that if we think stress is harmful, what often happens is that we tend to try and distract ourselves from our stress, and as a result not deal with the causes. So we might use negative coping strategies, which usually boil down to avoiding our stressors. And in the long run, because we're not dealing with our stressors, they can tend to compound, and it leads to more stress later on. So for example, if you're really stressed about that exam, but you're stressed to the point where you decide you can't cope. And so what you do is stick your head in the sand and you avoid it. But I mean, the issue is you're going to have to deal with the repeat in the long term, So the other kind of stress mindset we can have is that stress is enhancing. And people who tend to think that stress is enhancing, that stress isn't necessarily a bad thing and it's something that we kind of deal with in our day to day, they tend to have better outcomes. And the reason for that is that people who think stress is enhancing tend to deal with their stressors. They don't tend to run away from them. And this allows us to build resources and skills, both in how we deal with stress and also in dealing with our problems. And overall, this leads to less stress. So how can we, I suppose, considering everything I said at the beginning of the talk, how can we get into this stress is enhancing mindset? Well, it turns out stress has actually got some benefits. It makes us pro-social. It helps us engage. It gives us energy to deal with our problems. And it can also actually help us learn as well. So in terms of being pro-social, it's pro-social because when you're stressed, you actually release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is also known as the love hormone. And this leads to what's called the tend and befriend response. So a really good example of this is in kind of really stressful situations. So it was known during World War II, after the Twin Towers attacks in America after 9/11, and you would have seen it during COVID as well, is that when there's like the kind of big stressful events, communities and stuff tend to come together. And this is due to this tend and befriend response by oxytocin. Stress also can help us engage with our stressors and really help our performance sometimes. And so this is down to another hormone called DHEA. And this, we tend to create DHEA when we experience stress, but we see it as a good thing. So this is called the excite and delight response. So a very good example of this is people who take part in extreme sports. So people who parachute or people who base jump, people who put themselves in very dangerous situations in order to kind of, I suppose, experience that adrenaline. And when you're going into a stressful situation, but you see it as a good thing and it's kind of something you chase, then you tend to create this hormone DHEA. And it's got very protective features in terms of our heart health, for example. Another thing that stress allows us to do is to learn better. And this is in particular in the recovery stage or the stage just after something stressful. And this is because our brains have got increased plasticity in this stage. And what this means is that going through stress actually makes you better at it. So, for example, the training for astronauts and the training for firemen and the training for Navy SEALs is actually all very, very stressful. And the reason for that is one, they get better at handling stress, but two, because their jobs are by nature dangerous, they learn how to, I suppose, manage those situations and the stress involved in them better. So stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake, but most importantly, we have stress responses to help us do something about it. So how can we kind of, I suppose, engage this positive aspect of stress? Well, I'm going to focus on this question of whether, or I suppose when you think of that question, can I cope, whether we see something as a challenge or a threat and how we can kind of get that in place. Well, it turns out when we see something as a threat, we assume the situation is going to lead to failure and we don't have the strategies in order to cope with it. Conversely, we see a stressful situation as a challenge when there's an opportunity that we might gain from it, and we have an opportunity for self-growth, and we also have available coping strategies. And in terms of our performance, whether it be in exams or in a college situation, or whether it be on the rugby pitch, seeing something as a challenge over a threat can really affect our problem solving. So I want you to imagine you're sitting down to an exam, and the examiner is walking around, and what he says to you is that 85% of people who sit this exam fail, and it's generally people who've been trained in course X that have been successful in the past, and you haven't been trained in course X. So imagine how you'd feel. Now, conversely, I want you to imagine you're sitting in the same exam hall, but instead of that, the examiner walks around and he says, hey guys, actually 15% of people succeed in this exam. And it's generally people who show commitment and persistence that have been successful in the past. So you'll see on the left, is the situation has been framed as a threat. You're probably going to fail and you don't have any strategies to cope because you haven't been trained in course X. And on the right, it's been framed as a challenge. So you do have an opportunity to succeed. And you also have the available coping strategy because everyone can show commitment and persistence. So this was an experiment done by two Croatian psychologists in 2002. And so what they did is they got two groups, and one they framed the problem as a threat and one they framed the problem as a challenge. And crazily, the people where it was framed as a challenge, on average, were 47% more effective in the problem solving or in the exam, which is crazy, I would have thought. So how can we frame things as a challenge? Well, one thing we can do is phrase our goals positively. So often when we see things as a threat, often it's because we are using what's called negatively phrased goals. So we phrase a goal negatively when we talk about what it is that we want to avoid, or what it is we want to stop, or what it is we don't want. So for example, you might say, I don't want to fail the exam, or I want to avoid feeling stressed. And the issue with this is that what we're doing is we're focusing on what can go wrong, we're focusing on the negative, and this leads to this fight or flight response and all the negative kind of consequences of that. However, if we frame our goals positively, so we frame our goals around, what it is that we want. So you might say something like, I want to achieve, or maybe I want to connect, or what do I want to learn in this situation? What is it that you want to get out of the situation? And when you frame your goals like that, so you might ask yourself the question, how can I use the energy from my stress to achieve? Or who can I study with? How can I help my teammate? How can I maybe better manage stress next time? What can I learn from the situation? It tends to release these beneficial stress hormones instead. So we get this DHEA, oxytocin, and this increased brain plasticity, all about how we frame the problem. So one is it's a threat, it's a bad thing. Two is it's positively phrased. What can I achieve? How can I connect with other people? And what can I learn in the situation? So I'm going to finish up with a problem-solving model, which is kind of based on this idea of setting our goals positively. So what I want you to do, I want you to take that stressor, that thing that you've been stressing about. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes running through the various steps of what's called the GROW model. So the GROW model is it's a problem-solving model that allows you to, I suppose, deal with your stressor or solve some of your problems by focusing on kind of the four main areas of a problem. So the four areas are the goal, so that's what it is you want to achieve. The reality, it's where you are now. The options and the opportunities that you have to, I suppose, achieve that goal, and then the way forward. So what are the actual steps you're going to take? So we're just going to take 2 minutes on each of these. I'm going to run you through these questions, and then we're going to finish up. So what I want you to do, I want you to figure out what it is that you want to achieve in the situation. So rather than whatever is stressing you out, rather than it being to avoid stress or to not fail at whatever it is, what I want you to think about is, what is it that you want? What is it that you want to achieve? So we're going to positively phrase that goal. So just take a minute on this and write down your answer to these questions. What is it that you want to achieve? Maybe how do you want to actually feel? What's important? What's important to get done in the situation? And maybe what would a perfect solution look like? So again, rather than focusing on what can go wrong, focus on what it is that you want to do and what you want to get. I'm just going to give you a minute to write down your answers to that. So for example, if you were thinking in that exam situation we were talking earlier, rather than, I don't want to fail the exam, or I don't want to feel really stressed, maybe you positively phrase goal, maybe, I want to get a 2-1 in the exam, and I want to maybe feel relaxed going into it. What that gives you then is it gives you something to work towards, so you can start to break that down. The next question I want you to consider is the reality stage of the GROW model. So I just want you to write down a little bit now, where are you in relation to that goal? Where are you now? What's happening now? How far away are you from it? What are you actually doing? How does it feel? What exactly is the problem? What's getting in the way? What's holding you back? Where are you now in relation to that goal? So, maybe in this example I was using, maybe the reality is this. Maybe the reality is you're feeling stressed. Maybe you don't know what's on the exam even. Maybe you haven't opened the book yet, or you haven't watched the lecture. So, or maybe you've got a couple of topics covered, maybe you've only got half of it to do. So just write down what your reality is. Where are you now in relation to the goal? The next step is to consider your options or your opportunities. So I want you to have a think about, I want you to think where your goal is and where you are now. What do you need to fill in the gaps? what can you do about getting there? What can you do about making that goal a reality, if you get me? So a good question to kind of think about this here is, like, what are my options? What can I do? Maybe what are the pros and cons of each? Or a really good question to ask in this stage is, who can help me with this? You know, have you got friends or teammates or people that you can kind of call on to give you a hand, or maybe ask what they're doing? So for example, maybe with the upcoming exam example I used, maybe it's about forming a study group and each you take a lecture. Or maybe it's a case of maybe you work better on your own and you just need to, you know, put together a study plan. The final step of the GROW model then is, once you've kind of figured out what your options are, what you want to do is you want to figure out your way forward. What are you actually going to do about it? So which option is the best? What are you actually going to do? Which one are you going to choose? What is the next step? So what's the first thing that you need to do? What's the, like, to actually get some movement on this and stop that procrastination and actually get moving? And another good one to consider in this stage as well, if, you know, I've decided what my strategy is going to be, decided what I'm going to do, what am I going to do if that's not working? You know, what's my second option here? What's my backup plan? I think this can be a very useful model for dealing with stressors generally, because often, again, these things are running through and through our head, and actually get a pen and a piece of paper and to go, okay, I'm going to work through these 4 steps and actually give myself kind of short, actionable goals to deal with it. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up at this point. I think we're at 7:30. So just do a little conclusion. So today I talked a lot about stress, and I suppose a lot of the negative kind of consequences initially of stress and why stress is so bad for us. And that were based on the physiological definition of stress. So stress is a biological response to a stressor, and it's this hormone cortisol is released when we're chronically stressed. And so we talked about some physiological strategies like relaxation and meditation and exercise. We also talked about what goes on in our mind in a stressful situation. This is the psychological stress response. And so you're asking yourself the question, you know, is it stressful and can I cope? And so we looked at some reframing techniques and some coping strategies like expressive writing. And finally, we had a look at stress when you think about it as in a more problem focused kind of way. And a lot of that can be or a good way of dealing with that can be looking at what's called our stress mindset. So, you know, if we're seeing all our stress as a bad thing and we're sticking our head in the sand and avoiding our problems as a result, or can we see our stress as a message that it's something a problem that we need to deal with? And so we looked at the whole idea of framing our goals positively, so we can like frame them more as a challenge rather than a threat, and that problem solving GROW model. Okay, guys, I hope you found that useful. Sorry, there was a lot in today. I've kind of shared it at the beginning of the chat. If you like, I've got a Friday email list where I do book recommendations and upcoming events and stuff like that as well. I've also got a YouTube channel. Again, all those links are there, but a lot of the previous talks I've done are on that as well. So if you found it useful, maybe there's other topics you want to look at. And again, connect on social media or in the meetup. There's all links in the chat there. And other than that, thank you very, very much for having me. And I'll pass you back to Finney to wrap up, if that's okay.